Good morning. We'll go ahead and get started. I'm sure there will be others to come, but obviously it was a long but meaningful worship service this morning. So as an opening prayer, I would like to repeat a few words from the lectionary this morning that I thought was very appropriate to our topic. So please join with me in prayer. I'll be reading a few words from Revelation to begin. Revelation 21. Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and the sea was no more. And I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, "See, the home of God is among mortals. He will dwell with them. They will be his peoples, and God himself will be with them and be their God. He will wipe every tear from their eyes. Death will be no more. Mourning and crying and pain will be no more, for the first things have passed away." It is good for us this morning, great God, to hear those words as we delve into your divine kingdom, as we try to understand what is next. And we thank this moment, this opportunity. We thank the work of Robert in preparing for this. And we thank you for your presence and your spirit among us. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Thank you, Robert. It's all yours.
Well, thank you, Paul. Last week I introduced the topic of extraordinary experiences, extraordinary knowing, particularly focused on the near-death experiences that scientists have either had or have researched with others who have had those experiences. My choice of using scientists as the subject matter of the presentation and the book is that scientists are trained not to believe now what these scientists believe. And so when they say there seems to be evidence of an afterlife, or there seems to be evidence of extraordinary knowing that we can't explain by the present paradigms for explanations, well, it has a little more weight to it than if just I say that, because I'm not a scientist. And also, very personal with me, my father was a scientist, and before he died, he did have a near-death experience, which was a complete surprise to him. He never even heard of such a thing, and he thought it must be an hallucination. He was having surgery, he had cardiac arrest, he was out of his body, he saw his body being resuscitated, he traveled down a dark tunnel, he came toward a light, and there was my mother, deceased, standing in front of the light, and he felt enormous love, and he wanted to stay. That's sort of archetypical for this experience, but he'd never heard of it, read of it, and so his first thought was that's hallucination. I was under general anesthesia, I couldn't have had any experience like that. But I couldn't have remembered it even, because that's what you do under general anesthesia. Your memories are shut down. So that was totally anomalous for his understanding, and after a couple of years, he told me about it. He finally told somebody, he wanted to tell somebody, because he realized that it had taken away his fear of death. And I realized that my father had become a warmer person and didn't know why, till he told me about this experience. So today we're looking in another language at the same kind of question of extraordinary knowing. And that is the language of consciousness, because actually science does not have an explanation for consciousness. And it doesn't talk much about it unless you're a psychologist talking about pathological behaviors and so forth, but what it is and how it can be remains a mystery. So, in this presentation, we're not talking directly about near-death experiences. We're talking about extraordinary knowing, and I list 5 things here these are common words: intuition, healing, visions, dreams, mystical experiences, much less common. These kinds of knowing are not clear and not obvious and not studied in general by scientists. So scientific mysteries remain. The subjectivity of our experience is not explicable by science. Purpose and meaning, you'll find in scientific literature, is ruled out for the rest of the biological world besides humans in most cases. because everything is understood in the paradigm as being caused by previous events, which is a kind of materialistic determinism. So you'll find people questioning in science free will, the ability that anything can really change because it's all predicated on what's happened in the past. What's happening in this presentation is showing you the science that's an alternative to that view. So let's go ahead. I introduced you to two scientific organizations last week. One is the Galileo Commission, and it writes about consciousness, insights from near-death experiences and other transformative experiences suggest that we are all embedded within a larger field of consciousness. Field of consciousness is new language for science. And so we'll see perhaps as we go through what that might mean to scientists. Also, a group of scientists have signed a manifesto for a post-materialist science. In the universe, they affirm, mind is fundamental. Again, new language. Actually, this language begins with quantum theory. Mind is fundamental. What does that mean? It cannot be derived from matter. Mind is not just a brain product. And reduced to anything more basic. That's what fundamental means in science. It's the bottom line of explanation. What's beyond it is not known, and you accept this as fundamental to reality. Near-death experiences occurring in cardiac arrest, coupled with evidence from research mediums, further suggest that the survival of consciousness following bodily death and the existence of other levels of reality that are non-physical. This is quite a departure from past science. So we're going to look. We talked about one of the categories of knowing as intuitive. Elizabeth Mayer, a psychoanalyst, in her book Extraordinary Knowing, relates 4 conversations with professional intuitives. I'd never heard of any of these people. They hadn't heard of her when she contacted them, and she asked them questions, and they answered with remarkable accuracy. Just one case here with Ellen Tadd, when Mayer asked her to comment on the names of 5 persons she was considering as possible collaborators in a writing project, Tadd described 4 of them accurately, but was unable to find, however that manifests for her in the reality where she finds information on people, she was unable to find the 5th. A couple of weeks later, when Mayer called the number she had for this individual, she was told that that person had died before Ellen Tadd was asked to find that person. So Elizabeth Mayer was a complete skeptic until she began researching extraordinary knowing. Healing. We hear about extraordinary healing kinds of things. Consciousness healing. Dr. Robert Piles was diagnosed as having a life-threatening viral meningoencephalitis and a mass of disseminated sarcoidosis in his lungs. Sounds pretty awful. And he didn't have an answer, and neither did his doctors. He began to calm himself, meditating and running. And as he ran, he started focusing his mind on the lesions in his body. He could envision that, being the doctor that he was. He felt himself, as he ran, becoming those cells and those lesions, and was astonished, however, when the lesions began to shrink. After 3 years, he was healed. Biophysicist Joyce Hawkes was a complete skeptic, science, not necessarily an atheist, but an agnostic, but had no religious connections at all. But she had a near-death experience, and out of that, she became a healer. She was called to healing, and she learned from a Chinese healer about using the flow called qi, of how to find the energy in the body and to emphasize it and actually add to it mentally. Jeremy came to her with a broken ankle that had healed in its cast, and the orthopedic surgeon said, well, you're healed, you know, it's sore, but I can't do anything more for you. Hawkes said to Jeremy, osteoclasts are cells in your body that make create bone spurs after something like a break, but they also can dissolve those bone spurs. Those are cells, and they have to be activated to do that. And so she began with therapy, using her hand to activate those cells in his body, and she taught him how to activate those cells with his mind, and his ankle was no longer a problem for him. She also was trained by an indigenous healer in Bali, spent 10 years going there for training, how to accompany the death to their dying, to reduce the fear and to let go so the soul can progress. She went with, she describes going with an individual who is held back. He's fearful, and yet he's in great pain, and he wants to die, but he can't let go. And she went with him on this journey. She saw the frightening images that he saw with him and understood why, despite his pain, his soul remained attached to his body. But encouraging him, she said, the energy from this extraordinary light that's up ahead, once he saw it, is divine love, and they went together until he was free from his body and soared toward the light. Pediatrician Frank Oski had a vision of an angel. First time I've ever heard a physician describe having a vision of an angel in any published article. He became the head of the pediatrics department at the Johns Hopkins University, so no small person within the field, but he's unique in the sense that most physicians kept quiet about any such experience which might tarnish their career and undermine confidence in their scientific behavior. Oski woke up, he was unhappy that had so many kids dying from congenital defects, and he raised the question, why is this happening? And after he awoke, he saw a woman with wings and a light around her, and there's no other word for that, I guess, than an angel, and that's the word he used. And she told him that there were volunteers who had come back into life as impaired children with defects in order to stretch our own humanity, the humanity of the caregivers who care for these folks, because it's less than perfect now. William James, psychologist known for his work in the beginning of the 20th century, looking at dreams now in a couple of cases, he published an account of a missing girl whose body was found only after a woman named Nellie Titus, in a dream, saw where the body was trapped underwater. Her description, James says, enabled a diver to find the body, despite his lengthy but unsuccessful attempts days before. And so James concluded this case is solid evidence in favor of some kind of normal, supernormal faculty of seeing. Today we would call that remote viewing, because there are other experiences that substantiate that seems to be possible for some persons in some situations. Dream knowing. Neurosurgeon Alan Hamilton, while serving as a surgical fellow in Africa, he was asked to deliver vaccines to tribal villages. After a day's delay, he and an African traveled down a river until they came to a fork. And Hamilton assumed that his companion knew which way to go, but he didn't, so they stopped at the fork. And when they pulled over to the shore, an African man appeared out of the jungle and basically said he had a dream to come meet them, but his dream said they were supposed to come the day before. And they'd been delayed. But he waited because he trusted his dream. Hamilton was astonished that a dream had brought this man to the fork in the river and convinced him to spend the night there until they arrived. He writes, invisible forces and not flowing water of the river had led them to this stranger who would guide them to his village. So Hamilton, in his book, The Scalpel and the Soul, again, a very unusual title for a neurosurgeon to write a book like that, confesses that in Africa, he lost a sort of uncritical belief in science. Not that he didn't believe in science, but he was no longer uncritical. And instead, he began to appreciate these extraordinary ways of knowing things. Magic, dreams, taboos, curses. African taught me, he wrote, the supernatural lies just beneath the surface of our lives. Bob Berman, as a student, was studying for an exam before he became an astronomer, and suddenly had an experience of knowing that simply sort of blew his mind. I was suddenly gone, he writes, replaced by the certainty of being the entire cosmos. There was absolute peace. I knew with total confidence that birth and death do not exist. It's all one. That all is perfect, that time is unreal, and that all is one. The joy was beyond anything I could have imagined. The certainty could perhaps be better described as a recognition, an ancient familiarity of being home. I'm going to come back to this notion of home. He left the university for several years, traveled to the East, read, tried meditation, came back, became a scientist, and lived the course to tell us of his experience. Now, after quantum physics began in the 20th century, really, the notion that conscious is fundamental began to be articulated by quantum scientists. Max Planck was one of the earliest, perhaps the earliest, to use this phrase, consciousness is fundamental. What does it mean? He says, I regard consciousness as fundamental. I regard matter as derivative of consciousness. That's just the reverse of what the paradigm says. We cannot get behind consciousness. That's what they learned through quantum research. Because every measurement, every experiment requires consciousness. Every knowing requires consciousness. Without consciousness, there's no knowing, so there's no reality that's known without consciousness. Everything we talk about, everything that we regard as existing depends on our consciousness. 1931. Quantum physicist Erwin Schrödinger. Consciousness, he says, is a singular that has no plural. Mind is always now. There is really no before and after for mind. That's like space-time for Einstein and those who adopted his theories of relativity. This life of yours is not merely a piece of the whole existent, but it is in a sense the whole. Potentially. If you open yourself to it, as Berman found happening to him. Only this whole is not so constituted that it can be surveyed in one glance. Our seeing is always very partial, always very partial. Neurosurgeon Wilder Penfield was treating epileptic seizures in the brain, cutting out pieces of the brain that could perhaps allow the individual to no longer have these seizures. He discovered while he was doing that large areas of the cerebral cortex could be removed without abolishing consciousness. Also, he did not find any place in the cerebral cortex where electric stimulation will cause a patient to believe or to decide. Now think about believing and deciding. Is that mind activity? Spiritual experience? It's not just brain activity. That led him to affirm that our everyday experience, that our being consists of two fundamental elements, one mental and one physical, at least in the way we live. In his 1975 book, interesting title, The Mystery of the Mind, that's very unusual in science as well, a critical study of consciousness and the human brain. He writes, the mind is aware of what is going on. The mind is aware. What about the brain? The mind reasons and makes new decisions. It understands, it acts as though endowed with an energy of its own. It can make decisions and put them into effect by calling upon various brain mechanisms. Neuroscientist Benjamin Libet also argues consciousness is a fundamental property of nature, like the inertia of mass. That's an example in physical science. There's no explanation for the inertia of mass. It is what mass is. Fundamental physical phenomena, he asserted, are not reducible or explainable. We simply accept these as given in the nature of things. So now he's arguing that we should accept consciousness as given in the nature of things. We can only study how these manifestations affect, interact, and control what goes on in the physical world, and now, if we think of consciousness this way, in the mental world. Astronomer David Darling, who wrote a book entitled Soul Search, An Astrometer Explores the Afterlife, a very unusual title for an astrometer, says consciousness is an integral, irreducible part of reality. Again, the same attitude now, post-quantum theory. He reminds us the brain shields us by filtering most of our sensory awareness and selecting for consciousness only what seems, for our consciousness, our partial consciousness, only what seems most important for responding in the moment. Most of what's out there and coming into our sensory systems does not make it through to what you and I are now seeing and experiencing. Cognitive scientist Alva Noid says the conscious mind is not inside us, but instead is an active attunement to the world and achieved integration with the world around us. It is the world itself, all around, that fixes the nature of your conscious experience. Two scientists, a psychologist, Emmett Baruch, and neuroscientist Julia Mossbridge, authors of this new book, Transcendent Mind, Rethinking the Science of Consciousness, published in 2016 by the American Psychological Association. So that was really a step down this path of thinking that we're taking here. Receding from view, they say, is materialism as its dominant paradigm way of being, whereby physical phenomena are assumed to be primary and consciousness is regarded as secondary. Approaching is a complete reversal of perspective. According to this alternative view, consciousness is primary and the physical is secondary. Cardiologist Pim van Lommel, who I mentioned last week, did research on cardiac arrest with his patients in the hospital, in a surgical environment, so everything was being recorded and monitored, and they knew when the brain stopped working and when the blood flow stopped working. And then he found that among a good selection of these survivors of the cardiac arrest, they had had a near-death experience that they could describe and remember, and that it affected them over years. He went 8 years later and saw how they were doing, and it affected their lives. So he says here, neurophysiological research and concepts of quantum theory verify that consciousness cannot be localized in the brain. This is why Van Lommel and quantum scientists describe consciousness as non-local. That's a quantum word. What it means is it's not in a particular location. It's a negative way of saying what we don't understand. How can anything not be in a particular location? But not everything is physical. Your thoughts are not necessarily in a particular location. They're where? In communication. Deepak Chopra, Hindu philosopher and Western-trained physician, Hindu philosophy formulated as Vedic science, affirms the mind is a field, getting now that language of quantum theory, of infinite possibilities. Chopra asserts that what science now identifies as the unified field, the potentiality of the forces of nature that transform themselves into material events, is nothing but consciousness itself. At the quantum level, we'll see now, it's activity and energy, it's not materiality. Materiality comes out of the quantum level depending on how we interact with the quantum level. Physicists Paul Davies and John Gribben wrote a book called The Matter Myth. It's a striking title. Discoveries that challenge our understanding of physical reality. At the quantum level, they say, even the apparent solidity of ordinary matter, atoms, things that we describe as matter, melts into a frolic of insubstantial patterns of energy. They suggest the human mind is a result of this vast informational process. Peter Russell, physicist, explains that the scenes or sounds that constitute memory are all in the mind, not in the brain. The brain allows us to experience and talk about them, but that's not where they are. And they're likewise just modulations identified as in the field of knowing. That's his language. Similarly, when we imagine the future, when we think about experiences, sounds, smells, tastes, feelings, these are just arising in the same field of knowing in which our thoughts are appearing. Carl Jung, psychotherapist, also psychoanalyst, wrote about conscious and unconscious subjectivity. He proposed a model of the collective unconscious after finding in patients' dreams mythological motifs from cultures of which they had no intellectual knowledge. It was as though their dreams were plugging into some internet of myth, images, stories, symbols, and then they remembered it somehow. In an essay entitled The Soul and Death, Jung affirms that the psyche, the mind, we would say more colloquially, in its depth partakes of an existence beyond space and time, and partakes of what is inadequately and symbolically described as eternity. Thomas Campbell, physicist and out-of-body explorer, one of the few that I know who have both scientific backgrounds, not that I know them, but I've read about them, who have written about his experiences both as a physicist and as someone who has traveled out of his body and had those kinds of experiences. He says we are participants in an evolving consciousness ecosystem, the universe and beyond, as a mental consciousness structure that includes and transcends our experience within the universe. Every sentient being, not just humans, is a limited implementation of consciousness, created to serve a particular evolutionary purpose. And now we begin to get to the language of purpose, which is almost entirely missing in science. Within the greater consciousness ecosystem, our physical universe is within this larger evolving ecosystem, is his experience and his belief. What matters most is the development in this whole big, vast universe we're in, conscious as well as material. What matters most is the development of wisdom, understanding, and the capacity to love, says the physicist. Why? What's the purpose of the universe? Philosopher Philip Goff, in his book with this title, published last year, reminds us of the fine-tuning of the universe, which is very hard to explain. And there are many, many examples. I just give you one. If there isn't some purpose to explain this all as just random chance. The strong nuclear force binding the elements in the nucleus of the atom can be represented by the number 0.007, 7,000th. If that value had been 1,000th less, the universe would have contained nothing but hydrogen as it expanded. If it had been 1,000th or more higher, almost all the hydrogen would have been burned off in the Big Bang and water would have never existed. Therefore, no universe. No universe, no consciousness of any universe. Even if what began was still happening, no consciousness, because we're the ones who describe the universe. We don't know of any others. There may be others. We don't know. Mathematician and philosopher Alfred North Whitehead wrote, many a scientist has patiently designed experiments for the purpose of verifying his belief that animal operations are not motivated by any purpose. He may have spent time writing articles to prove that human beings are as other animals, that purpose is irrelevant for the explanation of their activities, his own activities included. And you will find this literature in science. Scientists animated by the purpose of proving they're purposeless, Whitehead suggested, constitute an interesting subject for study. So these scientists accept that there is some sort of purpose, obviously among humans, but also beyond that in a conscious universe. Physicist Paul Davies, The Goldilocks Enigma, what a lovely title for a science book. Why is the universe just right for life? And he writes, I do believe that life and mind are etched deeply into the fabric of the cosmos. Physicist Freeman Dyson wrote, as we look out into the universe and identify the many accidents of physics and astronomy, and nobody's claiming there aren't accidents in the universe, that have worked together for our benefit, it almost seems as if the universe had known we were coming. At the biological level, the dominant paradigm assumes causality is entirely due to past events, and there's nothing up ahead that's helping us go in any direction, which is what purpose is sort of all about, that somehow an organism is thinking ahead to guide choices going in that direction. Robert Rosen, biologist, argues to the contrary, there must be information about the self, about species, about the evolutionary environment, about the world, encoded into the organization of all living organisms. All organisms are doing their best to make choices in the world that's available to them, at the level it is available to them. Mathematical biologist A.H. Louis adds that most organisms can generate and maintain internal predictive models of themselves and of their environments, and they use these to act purposefully. If purpose has the meaning of making a choice between A and B of some sort, and that's what paramecium do on a sugar solution gradient. They go toward where there's more sugar, and they go away from anything that seems to be a danger. So all levels of our living world, plants now we know as well as animals, do at the root levels, combined with fungi. I mean, they do all kinds of things that don't just see them, don't reveal them as isolated objects. They are living beings. The Journey of the Universe is a book and a film. Mathematician Brian Thomas Swim and Confucian scholar Mary Evelyn Tucker remind us that after the origin of the universe, which created the elements, the very origin of the universe, the Big Bang, the elements of hydrogen and helium, dying stars then created the remaining elements, the supernovas that took billions of years to form and then to die. Therefore, the Journey of the Universe affirms the stars are our ancestors. Without the stars, without the supernovas that exploded, carbon, oxygen, nitrogen, all these elements that we need wouldn't be here. So, of course, we wouldn't be here either. Nobody would be here. Nothing would be here. Deepak Chopra and with physicist Manis Kafatos writes, reality consists of shifting, interchangeable states that emanate from consciousness. Quanta, plural of quantum, are packets of energy, whereas qualia are the everyday experiences of existence. Light, sound, color, shape, texture, these are experiences of other sensory animals, sentient animals, as well as us. Qualia allow us to connect everything together through a common property, for every single thing is an aspect of one field of consciousness. In a book entitled You Are the Universe, you get a quick uptake on that. We're the universe? Because we're the ones consciously creating our experience of the universe. And maybe there are others in the universe also doing that, but we don't know. But without somebody experiencing the universe, it only exists as an idea, or if it's materially all there, there's nobody to see the material. In a conscious universe, everything is alive. Quantum particles behave in a lifelike way. We know now they make choices, depend on how we interact with them, balancing stability and spontaneity, efficiently harvesting energy, and so on. A universe is defined, they say, by the creatures who inhabit it. That's a fact for who define it. Why are human minds creative? Science usually avoids the why question and only deals with the how question. How does it work? But now they're asking this question. Because the cosmos is creative. Why did human minds evolve? Because evolution is built into reality itself. Why do our lives have meaning? Because nature proceeds with a drive toward purpose and truth. And so if there is a spiritual field of reality, of consciousness, it's what perhaps many of us have thought about God as pervading everything in a sense, and giving it purpose and meaning, which can be entered into in our lives if we respond in certain ways. As we have seen from the experience and research of many scientists, near-death survivors often report experiencing God as a bright light and a feeling of unconditional love. Also, most near-death survivors affirm that they became more spiritual. Their word choice, not mine, they became more spiritual because of their near-death experience. So we're almost done. Near-death experiences of being back home. Very interesting. We saw that the astronomer felt like he was back home when he had his mind blown by his mystical experience. Here are 3 examples from the book written by the founder of the Near-Death Experience Research Foundation. Anna, the light understood everything. It knew I was finally back home. The light was God. Andy, the light knows me. Surrounding this light are millions of other lights welcoming me back home. I tell them, it's good to be back home. Sandy, another near-death experience survivor, I heard a voice in my head and knew it was God. We had never talked about God at my house, and I never went to church, but I knew that this place with this beautiful light, that was God, was my real home. So I end with just a reminder to us in our tradition of spiritual affirmations of going home. This is not the common word used in our hymns, but in the spirituals, it is much more common. Swing low, sweet chariot, coming for to carry me home, steal away home. I ain't got long to stay here. Precious Lord, one of the favorites of Martin Luther King, perhaps the favorite, take my hand and lead me on home. And then Amazing Grace, which is not an African-American spiritual, but it has that same quality for many of us in terms of our own worship. And then the final verse of Amazing Grace, it concludes, and grace will lead me home. So, if I don't know what time it is, if we have time for questions or comments, of course, I would certainly happy to respond or just listen. Happy to listen.
Anybody else's mind bending? I was trying to think of experience of my own, and the closest thing I would say was be those moments in my life where I knew, when I had this knowing moment, that there is God. And it goes past everything else, but those moments when, yes, God is real, however we're going to define that, but that was the closest thing I could think in my experience. But anyone else, experiences, questions? Kathy.
Introduce yourself, please.
My name is Kathy, and this is an invitation. On Saturday mornings, we have something called Sweet Saturdays, and traditionally it's always been women, but we are very open to anyone coming to join us. 8:30 we start our Sweet Saturday part of Saturdays, and then around 9 we start our video series. Right now we are doing one called The Divine Within, and this is like exactly what we've been learning about. They're in freestanding videos, so you don't have to be there for everyone, just come when you can. But yesterday, the spiritual leader who was interviewed talked about, really focused on the idea that we have to stop thinking of ourselves as being made by God, but being made of God, and how God is in all of us. And I think next week kind of talks about bringing out that in other people, which is always something to think about too. But anyway, I like that, being made of God.
Yeah. I would just add a comment. Last week, we heard briefly from Eben Alexander, a neurosurgeon who had a near-death experience, and he was in a coma for a week. They were ready to turn off the machines, keeping him alive, and then he just came back. He describes God as like a frequency, right, all around us, just like we're living right now with all these frequencies of electromagnetic systems and cosmic rays and neutrinos passing through our bodies and all reality. But just a frequency that we don't normally tune into. we're able to, and your experience is one way of seeing that. But he says in his book, it's just right there with us, but mostly we're not tuned to it. That's the way he sees God now. Well, you've been I'm not demanding questions or comments, but I have a prayer I'd like to end with if we should do that now.
So we have a few minutes yet. Anybody? I'd be
you.
interested to know if anybody has had experiences of unusual consciousness where the stories about knowing things that are going on in other places amazes me. Yes.
So I don't know the answer to this. I just want to pose a question. So let's say there's an infant and it doesn't know the universe is there because it hasn't learned it yet. For example, let's say it doesn't know about the animal, the lion. Do lions exist then? I think they do because the universe is there. I think it's a collective consciousness, like a bunch of people who experience it, and then it's there rather than individual consciousness. I don't know if it's. I don't know what to do with that thought, but that was what I was thinking.
Well, there is some literature about children knowing things that we wouldn't expect them to know, and children do also have near-death experiences. In the material I've studied, for instance, a child that's drowning and then is saved experiences time slowing down and then basically sort of ending. This is as a child, and it's as though as the child they stop thinking about the way a child would think about, oh, I'm dying, I'm drowning. They just suddenly were experiencing a level of consciousness that was not available to them in their childlike mind because their mind hadn't somehow been capable of that. There's also a scientist, again, a doctor, medical doctor, who at age 6 was fighting meningitis and not doing well and was near death. And she experienced God as all around her, which again is another way of, a child's vision of God is more like, oh, you know, some picture or something, old man, something, I don't know. But nothing like that. It was a different experience of being surrounded by love, and that was God, and that all meant that she would be okay, and she did survive, and she became a doctor because of that experience. And she was healed, and she felt she was called to heal instead of dying. And so she became a doctor, and she also writes about spiritually transformative experiences that do not involve a near-death experience, but like Bob Berman's, that just your mind suddenly sees everything in a very different way as connected. And sometimes you use the word eternal, but maybe timeless is a better word. That would be a word used within this language. Not eternal, that sounds like it goes on forever, but timeless. Not space-time as we know it, it's another frequency.
Yeah, I was thinking about how the conscious mind might relate to Alzheimer's. And as the brain decays, maybe the mind or consciousness takes effect. Can you remember what your mom, past mom was Alzheimer's and then
Okay. My mom was in an Alzheimer's unit, and eventually my dad got into a different unit in the same place. And so he was able to be in a wheelchair and up there to see her. But she was in a really, really bad end of Alzheimer's. But anyway, he died. And we did not tell her. There was no reason for her to be sad if she could be. She couldn't go to the funeral. She couldn't get in a car. She didn't want anybody to see her like that. We knew that. There was no reason to tell her. about a year later, when I was visiting her, she started to recite her long list of words that had no meaning, that were not a sentence or anything. And in the middle of it, she said, "Phil died." And then she went on. I don't know if somebody there told her or not. We never told her. Didn't seem to bother her. But how did she know that?
Yeah. There's a lot of evidence of lucidity reoccurring in people who are mentally impaired near the end of their lives. And as they get especially if they're in hospice, they get near that very moment when they are going to die, and they're also being observed, because if they're in hospice, that's happening. That then they see and say things that previously they weren't able to, apparently, because they didn't. And so the book by Christopher Kerr, and I don't see Jeff, but I think, Paul, was there a sheet printed that's bibliography there's a one-page bibliography that
I don't know.
Well, I thought
What was he
Jeff was going to
that?
print up I was asked last week to provide a short bibliography, and I gave it to him on one sheet, and I thought maybe it's in the back. I thought he was going to print it. Anyway, Christopher Kerr has a book. He's a hospice physician that has many examples like this. But I think it's probably a good time for me to invite you to either listen to or to join with me, if you wish, in this prayer. You'll see it's influenced by this material in language. It's also influenced by my own study of the New Testament, Abba being the word Jesus used for God, and appearing in the Gospel of Mark in one of Paul's letters as Abba, not as just God. And affirming that one of the things that this kind of literature might help us do is overcome our fear of death. Some of us in the room are a little closer, I suspect, than others. Speaking for myself, I'm quite sure I'm closer than many of you sitting out there. My father's experience affected me. I mean, even hearing him talk about it and then being with him at his death, which was very peaceful. No one really knows till they're about to die how they'll respond. But I'm not living with death on my shoulder somehow inhibiting my ability to try to live the life I think I should live while I'm living. And at the end of this book, I really say this, we need to live more ecologically, and that's a main concern I have, and I talk about it and write about it and try to live it. And to do that, we need to overcome fear. Fearful actions are not successful, in my opinion. Love, maybe. Not always, maybe. So I'm going to read this, just because that's the way I pray it every morning. You're welcome to join if you wish, but you certainly don't have to feel to. Abba, God of Jesus, may we heed the cry of the earth and the cries of the poor. May we live humbly so the soil will revive, more species survive, and nature thrive. May we resist temptation and evil by widening our compassion for life on earth. May we mourn our abuse of the earth's biosphere and repent of the harm we have done. Abba, Spirit of the cosmos, light and love, may your grace lead us home. And thank you very much for inviting me.
Thank you.